Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you're listening to a weekly podcast about books and life. Not necessarily in that order. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show on iTunes, or use our RSS feed with your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. We're also on Twitter, Instagram, and now SoundCloud at vmspod, on Facebook at facebook.com/virtualmemoriesshow, and on Tumblr at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com. You can support this podcast and get access to exclusive content with a recurring monthly donation via Patreon. Just visit patreon.com/vmspod and set up your level of support. Every week you'll get new material from our patron-only blog, and you'll also get to listen to my monthly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet, which features extra material from our guests and is only available to supporters of the show. So visit patreon.com/vmspod or paypal.me/vmspod and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. This is the 200th episode of the Virtual Memories Show. That's something of an achievement, if I do say so myself. And I'm probably the only person who's going to say so myself. But anyway, unlike the 100th episode where I decided to interview myself, fielding questions from past guests, I kind of figured I'd actually do an episode people might really want to listen to this time around. So that brings us to this week's guest, and it's Thomas Dolby. Now, I've done a few episodes with musicians over the years, but Thomas Dolby really breaks that mold. He's best known to people my age, at least, as a musician, and he had the huge early MTV hit, She Blinded Me with Science, which he can't live down, although he's reconciled to it. But the thing about Thomas Dolby is his second act as a tech entrepreneur in the 90s and aughts also really kind of helped shape how we use the internet today. And so that makes him a bit more interesting than a standard, he was a pop star in the 80s thing. I also have to say, Thomas Dolby may be the guest whose work I have spent the most time with of any of the authors I've recorded with or anyone else. His first two records, The Golden Age of Wireless and The Flat Earth, are among my all-time faves. His other three records, Aliens Ate My Buick, Astronauts and Heretics, and the more recent A Map of the Floating City, sneak into my rotation pretty often, too. In fact, Aliens Ate My Buick has what may be my favorite song of his ever, Budapest by Blimp. Anyway, you guys know I read a lot, but I also spend a lot of time listening to music. It's my go-to avoidance mechanism on all those plane flights and train trips I tell you guys about for work. So that isn't to say that this episode does not also have a book connection, because Thomas Dolby actually has a new memoir out. It's called The Speed of Sound, Breaking the Barriers Between Music and Technology. It's from Flatiron Books. I talked about it a bit during the guest list episode of the podcast a few weeks ago for my favorite books from 2016. I love this one. And somewhat for reasons I didn't exactly expect to. I mean, sure, I'm a sucker for Thomas's music career, and that part of the book is wonderful. But the second half of the book, which focuses on that tech career I mentioned, is just fantastic. It really goes into the Silicon Valley world that he found himself in, the ways he could kind of correlate the business models there with the business of music making, the way he just saw the internet in its early form and web pages as they were being originated, as HTML was first rolling out, and how music could be part of the internet and everything we experience now. So the common thread, and we'll get into it during the conversation too, but the common thread running through the whole thing is Dolby's compulsion to tinker and take things apart. In his early days, it's about building synths. This is in the late 70s and early 80s, and making songs. And then it becomes figuring out how the web works and how it can work. He always seems to be wondering why things are the way they are and how we can tweak them a little to make them better, which curiosity, I believe, is the core of human experience, or at least the good human experience. So that makes the book a fascinating read and made me really want to get together with them for a conversation. I should add also, in the book, Thomas also comes through as a person, not just the things that he does. And it chronicles how he found true love, how he started a family, wound up with the worst house in L.A. There's all sorts of fun personal aspects to the book too. So The Speed of Sound is a blast. It's one of my favorite books from 2016. Go pick it up. I promise you'll enjoy the heck out of it. And that, again, is from Flatiron Books. Now, I do want to note in this conversation, and we'll get to it in a few moments, we don't talk about the music making per se, because he covers that in the book itself. And so there's no detailed explanation of lyrics or songwriting technique. And if you're new to this podcast and you're just checking it out because of who the guest is, I should tell you that I like to learn about how my guests live and work and how their vocations have changed over the course of their careers. And that's a lot of what this conversation's about. That said, it does get a little nerdy. Now, here's Thomas's bio from the flap copy for The Speed of Sound. You should look up his faculty page at Johns Hopkins for a much more extensive bio. Thomas Dolby has spent his career at the intersection of music and technology. He was an early star on MTV and then moved to Silicon Valley, where he has had an extraordinary career as an entrepreneur. He has been named Johns Hopkins University's first Homewood Professor of the Arts, where he will help create a new center that will serve as an incubator for technology in the arts. He lives in England with his family. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Thomas Dolby. Basically, I'm completely incapable of figuring out what audience building entails. And I figure that means you and I have a lot in common.
Well, yeah. I mean, what I've found is that inexplicably, if you really stick to your guns, it pays off in the end, in not so noticeable ways. You don't see spikes in graphs, but over time you go, wow, I'm actually accumulating some respect here. That's sort of nice.
It was one of the great touches of the book, and we're already recording now, so I'll edit, trust me. Reading the book, I was assuming I would be very, focused on your musical career, given how much your work has meant to me over the years. And perhaps it's a sign of my midlife crisis and professional life, but I found the second half about your tech and business career to be even more compelling than the musical side. And in a sense, it was interesting to me that you sort of depict it as another language that you had to learn, like music. But I wondered, over the course of, I would say writing the book, but it sounds like the book accreted in a sense over time beyond simply writing. What did you learn about yourself?
It's interesting you point out the difference between the two halves, because I think as a musician, if you're the center of attention, you sort of breeze through things, and the industry was set up in those days to make artists just keep coming up with the magic fairy dust, and everything sort of revolved around them. In the tech industry, it was like pushing a rope a lot of times, having a startup and trying to get people to pay attention to sound and music when they traditionally hadn't, early on in Silicon Valley, just persuading people that computers should have speakers was a really tough sell. It seemed to be counterproductive.
And yet we go back now and listen to the 8-bit renditions of modern music just to have some sort of, fun retro approach, I guess, to those days.
Well, yeah, and you would think that, given that the only people really paying attention to music in the early 90s was Apple, who were considered sort of hippie dreamers by the rest of the industry, and, guess who's the top company in the world, and guess what the killer app was, for their products.
What's the best response been so far to the book? What have you heard in terms of either critics or just people writing you out of the blue about it?
Well, the response has been really good. A lot of people have said it's not like the standard formula for the sort of rock star memoir. I'm sure there are aspects of it that are very standard. I mean, all rock stars either want nothing other than to get a record contract, or either they want nothing other than to get out of their record contract, you know, and most of the memoirs coming out, and there's quite a few in this period, you know, will detail the problems they had with their record contract. But the response has been very nice. I mean, from hardcore fans who have followed all my music, they felt that this gave them a much deeper insight into what was going on in the background. Because typically in interviews and in media, you know, the questions are fairly standard and fairly superficial. It's quite rare that a journalist will ask you a really prying personal question, say, you know, but how did you feel about that? You know, that's not, whereas you have the option, you know, when you write your memoir, to go into that sort of therapeutic area, you know, and fess up to the your frailty and your vulnerability, you know. And that's something that I chose to do and I hadn't really done before. And in fact, in a lot of cases, I'd never really voiced or sort of articulated, you know, the downside of either the music industry or the tech industry. So I was doing that for the first time, whereas just reporting the successes was something that, you know, I had vocabulary for already.
Was there a therapeutic aspect to that? Has your wife pointed out a therapeutic aspect that, wow, you're a different man since making this book?
I think it's quite revealing, really. I think, you know, it's interesting because I consider myself a real introvert, you know, I mean, to the point of being a hermit almost. I mean, I'm never happier than when I'm out in my converted lifeboat studio staring out over the North Sea, sort of, you know, playing with sounds. I prefer sounds to people, basically. And yet I have this exhibitionist streak. So all of the work that I do is somehow focused on the moment when it gets revealed to the public. You know, as I hear this sucking sound all the time of that public performance and exposure. And very often, you know, our creative process sort of starts with visualizing, you know, an empty spotlight on a stage. You know, a guy walks on and sits down and starts playing the piano. What does he play? What does the intro sound like? He starts to sing. What's the opening line? You know, and then I work backwards from that. I sort of reverse engineer that moment. So it's given me a clearer understanding of my rather curious mixture of sort of shyness and arrogance. You know, but actually I realized that a lot of performers I've met have a similar style to them. Ranging from Eddie Van Halen to Joan Armatrading, you know, they all have this odd mixture.
Yeah, what was the moment for you, I guess, when you realized you actually had an audience? Not that there were people in an audience listening, but that there was actually that matrix, that interface between the artist and audience for you. Yeah.
I started recording before I really started playing live in my own name. You know, I'd played live as a keyboard player for Lena Lovitch and for Bruce Woolley and others. But then I went and got a record deal and got on the radio. And, I mean, in those days, early 80s, the only way you were going to get mass exposure to an audience was via a big record company, getting through the whole contract and recording process and getting on the radio, getting in their stores. If you didn't make it through that obstacle course, didn't matter how good your music was, the public was never going to hear about it. So there are very few of us that made it through, you know, that obstacle course, and so what was handed to the public was a very heavily curated, you know, filtered subset of all of the music that was happening. And so once you were put on that plateau, if it had quality, you know, you could expect it to do reasonably well, and your odds were fairly good. Versus today, when it's sort of like a lottery, you know, the barrier to entry is gone in terms of needing to get a contract, needing to get a record deal, getting an expensive recording studio, get on the radio. All of those things are gone because you can do it on your laptop or your, you know,
or some schlub from New Jersey can show up with some microphones. Yeah,
exactly. And I mean, you know, this was your album. You could make it. You could upload it from the train on the way back, and it would be there on SoundCloud or YouTube, wherever it was, and it would be accessible to tens of millions of people all over the world, along with thousands of other guys who are doing the same thing. So, you know, the odds are very different, but the access is a lot easier.
Yeah, how is that trade-off? Well, it's I guess that question of whether the tools and the distribution, if they were there when you were young, would you have become the artist you became? I mean, do you look at it in those terms, or do you just think it was a particular time and moment for the commerce, for the technology, for where music was coming out of the prog rock era?
That's a really good question. I think actually if I was just starting to make music now in 2016, I'm not sure if it would have lured me in the same way, because the lure that I have is to rarefied media at any given point in time. You know, when the technology or the technique or the business circumstances have just made it possible for somebody to dive in with a fairly high risk and high reward. You know, that's pretty much what has attracted me, you know, throughout my career, whether it was synthesis early on, whether it was MTV videos, whether it was music on computers, whether it was, you know, the web, mobile phones, DIY filmmaking, teaching even, you know. It's that's when I get most excited and most creative. And as soon as things cross the chasm and become mainstream, they definitely lose their allure for me.
And what pushes you on to the next thing then?
Well, it's really the thrill of the new, I think. And you know, there's always something around the corner which people are excited about but suspicious of, and kind of waiting for the early adopters to plow in there and make fools of themselves. And I stick my hand up and go, okay,
that's me.
I'll be your guinea pig. Thank you.
Do you see similarities at all in the book publishing experience and the music? I would say music production.
Yeah.
You know, for lack of a better term.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the industries are very comparable. You know, I think that now the book publishing industry is still about, you know, bricks and mortar and physically what you're holding in your hand, because I think that you know, that experience is still very fundamental to people, whereas music, much as people liked vinyl and liked gatefold sleeves and studying the lyrics and things, they were willing to give all of that up in return for having all the music in the world for a few bucks. You know, that was a trade-off they were willing to make, and that doesn't seem to hold true for books, because people like the paper and the physical experience. And I think, oddly enough, because we're so connected now and because we spend so much time in front of screens, I think that, you know, the physical experience of turning pages and focusing on the words like that is relaxing. You know, I think it's a relief for a lot of people from their gadgets.
That was even the case with the standalone Kindle from Amazon. The fact that it was not good at email, not good at anything else. It was I can just read a book here. Although, even though I was an early adopter of that, I've largely gone back to print.
Sure.
Just because, for the very reasons you say, you just want to not be checking your 10 million other streams.
And there's also an excitement around, going to the store and finding it and, checking it out and taking it home and opening it, or ordering from Amazon and the UPS guy showing up. I mean, there's this, and I think maybe this also explains the return to vinyl somewhat, is that if we sort of ritualize, the excitement of receiving the object and holding it in your hands and knowing that it's a limited thing. I mean, it has 380 pages. It has 22 minutes of music aside, and you flip it and you put on side 2 and you look at the lyrics, and I think that's maybe the same experience. I think some of that is a sort of backlash to the fact that in your hand, in a few key presses, you can access sort of almost anything in the world at any moment from anywhere.
Yeah, it's my thesis about when the vinyl crash is going to happen is going to be when all the millennials who were stuck living with their parents after the financial crash actually have to move for the first time. Right. And then they realize the same thing we did. God damn, I don't want to move all these records everywhere I go. And then MP3 and streaming doesn't sound that bad at that point.
Well, maybe,
We'll see if that's...
And arguing with your girlfriend or boyfriend about
who gets their copy of... Yeah. Can you talk a little about the... given that you're also a professor now here at Johns Hopkins, you interact with students, late teens, early 20s. What we were talking about, that idea of scarcity versus instant aficionado status. Yeah. To get a CD of The Flat Earth back in 1991, I had a friend of mine from college who was going to Berlin during the summer pick up a copy for me and bring it back to America because you couldn't get it here. I promise not to quote any of your lyrics back, or I'll try to. Once upon a time, you had to do that. And now it's, like you said, just touch your screen and you can listen to anything you want. What effect do you think that that has, I guess? How does that, I guess, make the approach to music differ?
For the students?
Yeah. And also, I suppose, for a creator like yourself.
Well, I mean, I think it means that you don't expect to encounter obstacles. You expect that if there is a problem, then you can solve it very rapidly. You Google it, you download the user manual, you find a forum where you can post a question, or you find a YouTube video where somebody gives you tips as to how to deal with that problem. And so, as you're a student today and you have an exercise or an assignment, and you can blast through it with the help of the internet. I mean, that's sort of a given. And I think the downside of that is that if there are obstacles, if there are roadblocks that you have to circumnavigate, often that's where you stumble on interesting solutions that weren't that weren't immediately obvious. And if you approach that with a creative mindset and say, well, that's where the real gems are going to be, is when I find original individual ways to solve these problems and present them and so on. So I try and take my students, out of their comfort zone, and I'll send them to an edit room and say, I'm going to switch off the internet and you can't use your phones and so on. And in a couple of hours, you're going to bring what you've done back and put it on the big screen and show it to the class, and we'll all talk about it. And so I try and encourage them to take that approach. Also, interestingly, and I mean, I'm not teaching. I'm teaching a very narrow sort of area of music, which is music for films, and it's very interesting to see how people, that they're mostly film lovers, and they know that music is important, but they don't really know the mechanics of it, and they sort of assume, well, if I ever get to make my own, feature film, I'm going to find a great composer to write a great score. Yeah. That's sort of the mindset, is that I want all my collaborators to be terrific. And what I try and teach them is, well, a great composer is one thing, but the right score for your film is something else. So let's break down some great scores and see how they actually work the way they work, and therefore, how do you begin a conversation with a composer about the right way to enhance your film? And there's no obvious way to do it. So, I mean, in fact, the subject that I'm teaching is one where they do have to sort of think outside the box, because there is no single correct approach, and nobody's going to really solve the problem for you, online or elsewhere. There is no user manual for it.
Yeah, what has the process of teaching taught you in that respect?
Well, it's interesting because it made me realize that I've done a lot of lecturing in my life, but not a lot of actual teaching, And so lecturing with a short Q&A at the end is not the same as teaching, It's not the same thing. Well, I mean, again, on a personality level, it's uncomfortable for me to be expected to be the most extroverted person in the room. And Johns Hopkins students are very bright, quite reserved. And for a lot of them, this is not their major. Therefore, they haven't done a lot of background homework prior to the class. This is just one of the stops on their calendar. So they're not very interactive in general. I'll ask a question and there's this sort of quiet, there's this hush, because nobody wants to make a fool of themselves, and I have to actually put somebody on the spot and say, "What do you think, James?" And James looks rather awkward and squeakily sort of offers an opinion, but it's hard to really get them going like that. So that's one thing. But then also, my exposure to 19, 20, 21-year-olds was, I used to be one, but I wasn't anything like them.
You didn't have any university experience.
I didn't.
Yourself,
No, I mean,
right?
I'd already been out of school for 3 years and working in a fruit and veg shop and roadieing for punk bands. By the time I was their age, so it's just very different. But academically, they were way past. Years ago, they were way past anything that I ever achieved. So that's number one. Number two, I have 3 kids of my own now in their 20s. But the way you are as a parent is different from the way you are as a teacher. And like becoming a parent, I don't know if you have kids, but you stumble into it and you find yourself sounding like your own parents. And it's like, wow, where did that come from? And similarly, for me with my teachers, I don't remember my teachers, but this is the end of our semester. And yesterday this kid sort of took me aside at the end of class and said he was very excited because he'd been offered an audition for a TV commercial, but this would mess up his delivery schedule for his final exercise, and was it okay if he extended it? And I had to say, well, this is a dilemma you're going to face often in your working career, and you're going to have to deal with it. And yes, it's exciting, and congratulations, but you have to think about where your priorities are. And if I was your potential employer, I would be impressed that you made the mature decision of saying, well, I'm committed to my final exercise. I will be available as of Tuesday, but right now I have this. I'd be impressed. I'm hearing these words coming out of my mouth. And he was hugely relieved to hear them. Thank you. I needed to hear somebody say that. And I'm like, where did that come from?
You have to follow your dreams, but...
Yes, exactly, yeah.
Did your parents experience as teachers at all? Did anything from that... is anything from that transferring into your experience teaching?
No, I have no idea how my parents, thinking about them and their personalities, I have no idea. My father, I imagine, I saw him lecture a couple of times, and he was an extreme Oxbridge academic, and I have no idea how he coped with one-on-one teaching or tutorials or anything. He really struck me as a lecturer, and I think probably that affected me going into it. I thought, well, I'm gonna preach my knowledge and experience, and they're gonna suck it all up. But that's not really how it works.
And do the students know your work coming in generally?
No, coming in they don't. There's a couple of musos in the class who had checked it all out because they check out all music, And if I go to Berkeley School of Music, they all know about me. But the average student doesn't. Although more than once they've sort of said, my dad told me I've got to take this class. God knows why.
I'm sorry. I would do the same thing if I were.
Well, yeah. But it's a bigger deal for the parents, But the parents are probably the ones footing the bill, so it's
usually
cool.
Yeah, I had that with Bill Griffiths, the guy who makes Zippy the Pinhead, which has been syndicated for decades. He teaches at the School of Visual Arts and says the students have no idea who he is. He's just some old guy who's teaching them cartooning.
Well, I'm fine with that. I signed a copy of my book from one of my students yesterday, and she'd made a point of finding out about me and the stuff that I did, in the meantime. But I wouldn't, it's really important that I've got something to offer them other than
name recognition.
Than the name, I talked to somebody whose kid was at Oxford and had learned poetry from Tolkien and E.M. Forster.
Yeah.
I thought, wow, that's kind of amazing. But, it's like, writing is one thing, teaching is something else.
Supposedly Nabokov was good. But,
okay.
He's an exception in a lot of different ways.
Right. But college-age students, not high school, I hope.
No, yeah, or younger, actually. Right. But was there anything about Stagecraft that lent itself to the teaching environment? Or even, crowd work or anything remotely like that? Is that something you found yourself flexing some of those muscles?
I get them to do presentations for the class, and I have a lot to hand on there, from Stagecraft and also from working at TED for all those years. I saw an awful lot of great speakers, and that's something I think it's useful for them to pick up. And again, I try and emphasize the things that they're not going to get from their other instructors, And I constantly feel like a bit of a fraud because I don't have a PhD and I'm not published. I've published papers and things like that. But then it brings me back to, but most of their professors, won't have this sort of life experience or, career experience to pass on. So I try and get those things to rub off on them.
Yeah. Oh, it's the closing line of the weekly email I send out for this show that I will ride imposter syndrome as far as it takes me. That's like when I was describing my job to you. I have no qualifications for that, but somehow nobody else is. Either no one else has picked up on it, or you start to look around the room and think, maybe they're not qualified either.
Absolutely.
That can also be the case. So, most venal, craven industry you've been involved in? Music, tech, or academia? Kingsley Amos has a lot to goof on with academia, but I figure you're still just starting out in that space.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the music industry.
Mm-hmm.
There are similarities, although day to day they're very different. I was struck when I entered the tech industry that it seemed quite grown up. But what's comparable in both industries is that if you have the magic ingredient, then things are sort of geared to revolve around you. They'll feed that talent and try and nurture it. And because if you're just a middleman, if you're an intermediary or a money guy or whatever, or marketing, you've seen enough people come and go, and some of them had that magic ingredient and some didn't. So if they can see that you have it, then they will really nurture it. And that was true for both industries. The thing that I found annoying really about the music industry in decline as it was, for the sort of last decade that I was in it, was that I think they saw the writing on the wall. Although they put the brakes on, when the internet came along and everything, I think there was a feel to the industry that this was a house of cards, really. That the situation of there being half a dozen corporations in the world, a sort of oligopoly that could basically dictate what music was available to people, because they had the
distribution and the market,
the fleets of trucks and the pressing plants in Mexico and all. They had all of that sewn up, and the heads of the companies kind of would play golf together at the weekends, and they basically decided how it was going to be. But there was a sense all the way down, because there are a lot of people working in the industry that were basically music fans, couldn't really believe that they were able to draw a salary and still be music fans, and loved the regalia, loved the partying and the tour jackets and all the rest of it. And I think it just had a sense of an empire that was about to crumble. Whereas in the tech industry, it was, when I got to it, it was right at the point where it was moving from stamping out silicon chips, and making faster computers into, well, these really have the potential to change the world, and change people's lifestyles. And it didn't have to be just about the enterprise and productivity. It could be about entertainment and lifestyle as well. So all of that was really unfolding as I was in that industry. So they were sort of opposite in terms of where they were at in their development. So that made them very different. So was it venal? No, I mean, when there's money involved, it's always going to be to a point. But the most of the money that I touched in that period was speculative money coming in from angels and VCs, and they saw the talent and the possibility, and they had money that they could afford to lose. Mm-hmm. So it's a different situation from the music industry, where it was money they were desperately trying to hang on to while they could.
Right. Yeah. Are you capable of watching Silicon Valley on HBO?
Yes, I am actually.
Okay, because I just reading the book again, I was like, oh God, he lived this entire, and it really was about video decompression or codecs and everything else. It's not even like it's just a tangential Thomas Dolby thing. It really felt like it's
yeah, no, I mean, I've watched a few episodes. I'm not a huge fan. It was a little bit like when I asked Eddie Van Halen about Spinal Tap. Because generally
that's a great story.
You can you can break the ice with a musician anywhere in the world by quoting Spinal Tap, and on Eddie it just didn't work.
I laughed and read that part out to my wife from the book.
Right, yeah. And I asked him whether he'd seen it. He said, "Yeah, man, and we didn't think that was funny." It's like somebody just followed me around with a camera and put it up on the screen, and everybody fell over laughing.
Again, cliches come from solid sources.
Sure.
What do you think accounts for the deep appeal of your work? Like you mentioned having rabid fans, sort of hardcore base. Are you able to look back at your work and see what it is that they're really pouring into or diving into and sort of dissecting?
Yeah, and it's a pyramid, by the way. I mean, there's a very small number of the rabid fans and a much larger number who know about me through the usual predicted sources, because of exposure on the radio or MTV or jukeboxes or the earworm thing that is the pop charts, So that's the wide and that's that rung of the pyramid. The people that get deeper into it, thankfully, they like the stuff that I really like, and I mentioned this in the book, that, if I'm sitting there noodling at the piano and I find a chord change that just hits me emotionally, just has a flavor to it, and then I think, well, but how is it going to come over that way to people in the world? I mean, they're so different and diverse from me, and I'm a musician and I have a very, finely tuned ear, but it's not typical. So why would it have the same effect on any kind of an audience as it just had on me when I played that? But amazingly, I would do it and put it out, and then the internet came along and people would analyze the music and they go, oh, and that chord change into the middle eight. It's like when I hear that, and they would then list how they felt. I'm like, wow, it actually worked. It corresponded to the way I felt, and that's an extraordinary thing. So similarly with, I don't write relationship lyrics. I don't write typical pop lyrics. I sort of start where the typical pop lyrics leave off, and so that's the obsessions that I have about geography, about history, about the planet, about technologies and their faults, about possible sort of parallel worlds, whether they're dystopian or fantastic or whatever, what could have happened, and very often about my role in those worlds as a kind of a dissident, as the underground resistance movement. I've always sort of cast myself in that mold, and that seems to be what connects with people. I mean, there's a certain type of person that identifies with that appreciates that, and so on.
In fact, it's a question I have. The book, the memoir, starts around the age of 16 or so. As you said, you quit school, or left school 2 years early, working in a fruit and veg stand. What was the science fiction you were reading? What were the literary things? I mean, A Golden Age of Wireless has that, Boys Weekly, look to it from the cover. The first couple of albums have pulp culture, in a sense, as the lyrical threads running through them. What was your literary childhood?
Well, it was classics, Asimov and so on, through to Heinlein and through to I can't remember when he started appearing, but China Miéville and people like that. But I was never a sort of deep sci-fi fan, and again, I've always liked the sort of psychological situations more than the science itself. I may come over as a geek, but I'm always more interested in the creative possibilities that technology offers, or the challenges that it presents versus the gadget or the
hard science.
Yeah, the hard science
and the romance of it.
And I'm definitely not a hard scientist. I have no patience for actual solid, scholarly research.
Yeah, do you find that disappoints people? I know you did an event recently with one of the Mythbusters B team. Was there a sense of no, I'm not a scientist.
Right.
I tinker, I play, I'm curious, but I'm not.
Is it?
Do people have a certain expectation?
I think they're probably a bit disappointed. I mean, it was certainly quite embarrassing when my book was #1 in the Amazon acoustics and physics of sound category.
I'm sorry.
Ahead of books that are actually about acoustics and physics of sound written by people that understand them. That certainly, and it was a book of the year in the science category, which is kind of ironic. I think some intern just stuck it in that category for a goof.
Yeah. If it was in tech or business or something, that would, along with the music side, that makes sense.
Music memoirs, yeah.
But science, well, again, you've got one word to live up to for 35 years now, I guess.
I know. And the other night I was playing Cards Against Humanity. Have you ever seen that?
I've heard, but I've never played it. So,
okay. Well, you get handed cards and you have to string together sort of sentences based on, blanks and things. Yeah. And one of the cards just said science, and this caused a great deal of mirth around the room. Of course, that was handed to me.
Match. You made music again you made an album again after almost 20-year layoff of, I think, 91 to 2010. What did you have to relearn in the process of that? And what did you find that you were actually better at as an older artist, or as a more mature artist? Sorry.
Well, I didn't really have to relearn anything. Your playing and singing chops are a set of muscles like any others. I mean, if you went back to running marathons after a gap of 18 years in middle age, then you would have your work cut out. So from that point of view, that was quite challenging. But at the same time, my playing chops have never been central to what I do. I'm quite, some of my best solos I've typed. That's never been that important. And as far as singing, I actually think I'm a better singer now than I was when I started out.
How's that changed?
Has it changed?
Yeah, how has it changed?
How has it changed? Something happens as you grow up in terms of the way sound enters your skull. And I think this is why, older people like more rounded sounding music. They like, they're more likely to like jazz and classical, for example, versus screaming techno or dubstep or whatever it may be. And part of that is that physiologically, I think when you're in your teens or 20s, you're more receptive to sort of the more grating frequencies, and they become unpleasant as you get older. And that's something physiologically that happens. It's not just a taste cultural thing. Something about, you'd have to ask a true scientist to understand that. But similarly, you get, if you started out singing very nasally, then over time you tolerate that less and you want to sing in a more rounded fashion. So, I'm singing sort of more through my head and less through my nose than I used to.
I shudder to ask, but thoughts on recording more music?
Yeah, I would love to. Again, going back to the empty spotlight thing, I have no record deal. There's nobody screaming out for me to go on tour, so, I'm not hearing that sucking sound. I kind of feel that given that I'm teaching film music, I ought to do some of that because I haven't done that for a few years. And when I did it, I didn't really analyze it. So I'm teaching students stuff that I haven't thought about until now.
How has it changed from the era in which you were doing film scoring, which you began doing in the mid-'80s? Do you notice things in contemporary movies? Do you notice a progression or a change in the way scores are done?
Well, when I started out, there were very few people and very little equipment that was capable of doing sort of orchestral sounding music using machines. And now it's very, very easy. So, if you wanted to create a sort of Hans Zimmer type action movie score, you could do it with a few $100s worth of software these days, and probably less talent, actually. I'm not saying that there's no talent involved. There's an enormous amount.
There's a lower barrier to entry.
There's lower barrier to entry, and you could do something resembling that score relatively easy, and there are thousands of people that would be capable of doing that. They couldn't do what he does, but it would be, definitely a lot easier. And because of that, the filmmakers, the producers, the directors, the first thing they want is a temp score which will bring a rough cut of the movie up to a watchable level for themselves or the audience. And they'll say to you, well, I want something different here. You can do it with that machine of yours. I'll go get a cup of coffee and come back.
And it'll be done.
And give me a choir instead. And I'll be back in a minute. And they sort of expect it to be done.
And is it almost that easy to do?
No, it's very hard. It's very hard, to do.
Right.
It's hard to do to a convincing level. It's easier to do to a cheesy level.
Yeah. Is there a and this is going to turn into one of those goddamned kids things, but is music too easy to make now? And does that present a new set of challenges to make something that's actually
Well, I mean, it's not easy to break through. In a way, it's no easier than it ever was. You know, the path to it is different. But I don't. It's too easy for me to make. You know, that's why. Again, that's just sort of why it doesn't appeal to me as much. The flip side is that if you were to do what's called a tracking session, where you have several musicians playing real instruments in a studio at the same time, that's still very hard. And it's always been hard, you know, to get that right. And it's a magic thing, you know, because for the first hour they're hugging and telling stories about the last tour they were on, and then they get hungry and they need to order in the Indian food, and then they might tune their instruments and pay attention. But about an hour after that, they're too tired to keep going, you know. So the studio had better be functioning right for that magic hour, and you better be totally focused on capturing their performance, because it either comes together during that hour or it doesn't. And that, you know, all of the skills involved in that for the musicians and for the producer are no different than they were in any previous decade. You know, it's exactly the same thing. I mean, the technology is slightly better, but the basic set of skills to capture a recording session like that haven't changed. So again, this is a bit like vinyl. You know, it is what it is. It's a precious and rare thing. And I value that more, you know. So I have, if you force me to make some music tomorrow, I'd rather do it like that, because of the thrill that you get from it and the sense of occasion you get from it. If you told me I had to sit up all night twiddling knobs in the other room, that would not thrill me at all.
Gotcha. Okay. The book includes a number of anecdotes of we'll say heroes of yours, and geek out moments that you've had around them. Are there any artists you would still have that reaction around, or is everybody have you met pretty much everyone who would have overwhelmed you, and B, you're a bit more jaded now?
I think I'd say I've met all of the ones that would have overwhelmed me in the past, and worked with quite a few of them. You know, there are some I haven't actually worked with. I mean, I've met Brian Eno a few times, but never actually sat in a studio with him, so that would be fascinating to see him work.
Yeah.
But aside from that, no, not really.
You mentioned Marvin Gaye being the one you didn't get to meet before.
Yeah.
Is there anyone else you regret not having had the chance? Only because when I interviewed Irvin Welsh, he stood up David Bowie twice for journalism assignments.
Oh, dear.
Because he couldn't do it.
Oh,
he
really?
said, I couldn't, because I had his posters when I was a kid. I can't possibly be in a room with David Bowie, which I'm sure now he regrets. But do you have any of those, either from ones that have now passed, or people you still had that, holy crap, this is somebody I was idolizing, a la Eno?
Brian Wilson, possibly. I mean, there are a lot of people who it would be surreal for me to be in the room with, not because of their celebrity status.
Yeah.
You know, I mean,
Now everybody's Joe, really.
Yeah, everybody's Joe, you know. And if I was sitting here talking to Lady Gaga or whatever, it would have a certain, oddness to it. But not related to the fact that I adored her when I was a teenager. You know, she wasn't born when I was a teenager. Yeah. You know, so that's whereas somebody like Brian Wilson, it's like the hours I've spent picking through the arrangements and listening to things over and over again, and wondering about what the heck is going on when those synapses fire off in his head and all the rest of it. Yeah, there's a couple of people like that. No, I mean, I suppose a sad thing, as you grow older, is that those little pieces of magic, those bubbles get burst, through your life. But I still, YouTube is a funny thing because it dredges up pieces of your past that you've forgotten all about. And when I wrote the book, when I was writing the David Bowie section, I'd forgotten that I was ever interviewed with him. I mean, I remember seeing Live Aid on TV, and there's like about 2 seconds of me, and he introduces me, and that was it. And I was like, oh, is that all I get? And I'd completely forgotten that I was interviewed backstage. So somebody sent me a link saying, here is a YouTube video of you and David Bowie being interviewed right after the set. And I'd completely blocked that out, And I watched this clip, and it's like Bowie is he's just come off stage in front of 110,000 people, perfectly poised, perfectly coiffed, able to answer questions about starving kids in Ethiopia, and next to him is this guy sort of like with a can of beer in his hand and a cigarette going, it's David fucking Bowie. I can't believe I'm sitting here with David fucking Bowie. Yeah. So that's quite embarrassing and humiliating to watch. And I understand now why I suppressed it.
US versus UK?
Right now?
Well, now, Jesus. We're not even going to talk. You're the second person I've interviewed post-election. I'm not going into it. I can't even. I don't expect you to either.
No.
So,
well,
in general, though.
I had this dilemma slightly in the days of Reagan and Thatcher, but I won't go into So, okay, well, in general, in the US, there is a willingness to get things done and to... People are curious if you come up with a problem that they haven't encountered, they see it as a business opportunity. It's like, well, how can I help you solve this problem, and how can I hop on your bandwagon and so on. Whereas there still in the UK tends to be, nah, mate, we don't do that here. No, it's not what we do. So I've always found it quite hard being an oddball in the UK, and then people, when they don't understand your eccentricity in the UK, they try and explain it in terms of, class and background and so on. For example, the aristocrats in England are sort of expected to be a little bit eccentric, Yeah. So if you're a bit eccentric, people are quite quick to explain that because of, centuries of inbreed and all the rest of it, or because you're an East End wide boy, selling fruit off a barrel, or because you are X, Y, and Z, that they tend to pigeonhole behavior in that way. And so I always slightly had the problem that I was, that I didn't safely fit into any particular category. And this is true also of, in the music press. The fact that what we're really good at is going out in the world and finding, indigenous music or spices or silk or whatever it is, and bringing it back and, tweaking it a little bit in our own factories and then re-exporting it to the rest of the world. And they go, wow, that's, you would only get this out of England. That's been the case all along. So what the English music press does is they try and assign the same kind of indigenous qualities to music that comes out of England, So, for example, I would have a record out and the Smiths would have a record out, but Morrissey grew up in the Manchester projects and, before his tea was even brewed in the morning, he jotted some poetry on the back of an envelope and that was who he is. And the clothes he walked on stage wearing were what he would be wearing at home, and there just happened to be a microphone and an audience there. Whereas I was a product of middle-class academia, private schools, and I made music that you couldn't easily categorize and that clearly was had stuff borrowed from all sorts of different places, and therefore I was, suspicious to them. And yet I didn't go all the way and say, this is just showbiz, this is just ABBA, this is just, Erasure, this is just Prince. I never owned up to being just an entertainer. I had the trappings of being a serious artist, and yet they couldn't see the same authenticity in my background that would explain serious art, if that makes sense. So I was never, combine those two things. I was never very comfortable there. I would always get off the plane in the US and heave a huge sigh of relief. I felt, free.
And you moved to Baltimore. Had you watched The Wire before moving out here or not?
No.
Okay. Have you watched it since?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that was part. I mean, we sort of my wife and I binge watched The Wire for the first few weeks that we were here. It was part of the coming of age process.
The indoctrination or decompression process.
And then, we'd hit the end of an episode and hit stop, and then outside the city sounded exactly like the soundtrack of The Wire. It's really interesting. I mean, what I had seen was the nicer side of Baltimore. When you tour, you tend to see airport lounges, backstage, nice hotels, and so on. So you don't really see the seamy underbelly of a city. And I knew that was going on here. I had no sort of doubt about that. But ironically, I mean, I don't own a car. we're southeast of where I work. I take the bus. If I take the bus that goes west and then north, I see cobbled streets, row houses, sweet little cafes and restaurants and bars. Then I see the built-up downtown with all the brands. Then I see the old merchants part of the city with the Washington Monument and big merchants' houses. And then I see the Hopkins campus. If I take the bus that goes north and then west, it is the wire.
Yeah.
And I can't separate it from the wire. I mean, the conversations I hear on the bus are like the script from the wire, and I don't even notice them anymore. At the beginning, I would notice if the guy behind me talked about how his cousin got shot, by a stray bullet last week. I don't even notice that anymore, or the methadone clinic, or the court cases going on with the custody of the kids. Or I'm sort of immune to it, and the people are completely starved of resources, and they're really no different, but they can't, never had access to good education. They can't get fresh food in a grocery. There's nobody's doing anything for them. And in fact, post Freddie Gray, the police don't come to their neighborhoods anymore because it's too risky for them. There's too much scrutiny. So there's worse policing now than there was. I mean, less of it. Yeah. And that's just the beginning. And being in a wealthy institution in a city like this is a bit like traveling to a third world country. I don't mean in the
not in a
Donald Trump
way.
sense,
Yeah.
but I mean when you go to a third world country, the change in your pocket could change somebody's life.
Yeah.
But does that mean you throw it in the street for the kids? It's not always clear how you respond to that sort of imbalance and that cycle of poverty.
This is the first city you've lived in where you've been exposed to that level? I know L.A. is a really weird... when I interviewed David Bayerwald, he said it's a city of neighborhoods.
Yeah.
It's not a city. You can spend your entire life and never see a lot of the...
Yeah, if in LA, if I'd driven 40 miles east, I might have encountered the same... I don't know. Who the hell knows? It's much more in your face here, from block to block. I'll tell you what it is. It's the first city I've lived in where almost everybody you meet is actively trying to make things better on a day-to-day basis. And that's partly the world that I'm in. But, the security guy, the Uber driver, the refuse collector, the UPS guy that delivers, if you get in conversations with them, they are volunteering for this. They've got a kids after-school program that does this. They're helping out here or there. There's so much going on, in an effort to improve it. And there's also some lethargy, I'd say. But other cities I've lived in, people were just looking after number one. That was it. There might have been bad stuff going on around you, but you were going to get through it and improve your own situation. And there's much more of a communal sense here of, we can get through this and make it better.
Are many of your students from the area? I figure Hopkins is a pretty broad international base.
It's pretty broad. Not that many Hopkins students, but I have MICA students in my class as well, and that's the Maryland Institute of Contemporary Arts, and there are more local students there, and in fact they're generally more outgoing. They've got tattoos and piercings and green hair and so on. They're more likely to stick their hand up, and it's actually good to have that blend of the different students.
I was just reading a Martin Amis interview yesterday where he mentions not reading pretty much any work by writers who are younger than him. Do you keep up at all with contemporary music, with pop, with electronic, with anything?
I don't actively keep up with it in terms of finding out about the artists.
Yeah.
I listen to music in public places and people's playlists and things like that. But I don't generally delve in and find out about them. And I think that's the big difference, really, is that music that I liked when I was younger, I had to know where it came from, and how it was made. And now I'm not really so interested. So no, I don't really keep up with it.
I have a friend who would have flown out here from Seattle to attend this get-together, except he admits he would have fainted at the sight of you because he's that level of fan for you. He wants to know what your desert island synth would be? Like the one synth that you just think the world would not be right without it?
I suppose probably a Roland Jupiter 8.
And if there was a synth in every elementary school classroom, what would it be? Because he's teaching his nephew now, and he says he's got the Mini Moog thing, but only because the knobs are really big.
Yeah, no, I think Mini Moog would be perfect. Yeah. Now they wouldn't stay in tune, and they're very bulky, and the pots tend to get crackly and things. But I think that would be the one.
And this last question: do you see the interface getting past the keyboard metaphor?
Yeah, I mean that's a really good question.
Oh, he's a real smart guy. He's just incredibly, worked up about the thought of you.
Well, the problem I have with interfaces in general is that as technology has got more powerful and it's become more possible to emulate analog machines with a digital interface, the issue is that the sort of affordances of those interfaces, in other words, what they suggest to you as a means to work, have been inherited from people that used to be specialists in different areas.
Sure.
So, for example, that tracking session I was talking about, there would be a producer whose job it was to understand what the musicians were doing and to direct them and get the right take. And there'd be a sound engineer who is the one hunched over the knobs, figuring out that if he said, the trumpet is too bright, then, 5 kilohertz minus 3 dB is going to be the knob that he's going to go for. And so there's a sort of left brain, right brain thing going on. Now there's a software package that expects you to have all of those skills at the same time, as well as being the songwriter, as well as being the performer, the singer, and so on. And that, those interfaces are not designed for a single brain. So you combine all of those features into one package, and it's impossible for one person to multitask to that extent. So in reality, if you need the trumpet player to also change the tone with which he's recording, you don't really want knobs with numbers on. Yeah. You want something that will work for a trumpet player. Like a trumpet player can pull a mute out of his case and stick it in the end of his trumpet, or he can add a bit of linseed oil or whatever it is, to his mouthpiece. So the right interface for him in software should be something with his hands, something that is visual, something that is intuitive, an intuitive way to affect what he's doing. But instead, he's got all of these knobs and numbers inherited from the sound engineer side of things. So that's the problem, is that all of those skills are dovetailing into single powerful interfaces. And it would be nice if there are alternatives to that. So I'm very interested in alternative controllers. I mean, Imogen Heap works with a glove. There are things that will be possible in virtual reality, which are quite interesting. I tried on the other day a Microsoft augmented reality headpiece, which means it has glass, so you see the real world, but
with
you have
an
overlay like Google Glass, and you were using gestures to do things, even sort of sign language type gestures. That it would recognize. And I thought that was very exciting, that there's the idea of something like that as an interface for a musician could be really thrilling.
It brings up another passage from the book when you first delved into VR, which, again, I was a cyberpunk geek, and I went to college 89 to 93, so it was just in my wheelhouse, coming out of William Gibson, et cetera. So the idea of all those things we cared about in Mondo 2000, finally in 2016, we're starting to see how they actually
with Fiorella Terenzi on the cover.
Right, I remember that. I was thinking, you mentioned her in the book somewhere, and I thought, I remember that from so the kind of curvaceous.
Well, she still looks exactly the same. Amazing.
Oh, that's good. I didn't look her up. I should have. I didn't want it showing up in my search history, I guess. But weird meta question, which you can not answer if it's too much like a therapy session. But when you talk about in the book the act of building the book, coming out of past journals, notes, et cetera, and the ephemera of your life, did you see any parallels between that and your father's background in classical archaeology, in a sort of digital archaeological sense? Or am I just overreading into my own problems with my old man?
I don't think I really did see a parallel. I mean, I early on in my life, I used to think that my father's obsession with sort of dirty old pots, I couldn't relate to that at all, in dusty museums. And then through traveling with him, I realized that actually what he was fascinated by was the storytelling, and the imagination, and the fact that the history that he was dealing with was not written down. It was painted on pots. It was handed on orally in the poetry. And there was a thin line between mythology and fact, and it didn't really matter. It was real because the artists had chosen to depict it in that way, and so it became the truth. That was his view, and I definitely saw a parallel between that and my own songwriting. So that was great. In terms of teaching, I don't really get it. I don't really get the parallel there.
And in terms of building your own memoir from the artifacts of your life? Okay, I'm stretching.
Somewhat.
I'm stretching. Okay.
It wasn't really that hard because everything I ever wrote, when I would read it, I could still relate to it. I never had that same effect that I had with the Bowie clip, where I do not remember this at all. If it was a diary entry that I'd scrawled in the back of a Filofax in 1982, I would read it and I go, oh yeah, I remember how that felt. I remembered it. There were very few details that surprised me or anything like that. I could still relate to it very clearly. And I hope actually that was partly because writing it down sort of commits it to memory in a certain way. So that's a good reason for people to write stuff down. A lot of facts were checkable, online in terms of piecing the timeline together. I could fill those in. And there are a few people I had to go to reference other things. Fortunately, I had a manager during the 80s who was incredibly anal about keeping his files. He's still got an attic full of my, tour accounts from the Flat Earth tour and things like that. So I knew he'd be a good source, for a lot of fact checking. So it wasn't particularly hard putting that together. The interesting piece of it was that sometimes when I fact-checked with people, their memory that they'd retained of something was very different from mine. Mm-hmm. And there are a couple of things where I had to actually leave something out of the book because I just didn't remember them the same way as somebody else. And I didn't want to print something that was my memory that was actually opposed to somebody else's clear memory of a particular situation. So I left a couple of things out.
Speaking of, second book?
Well, possibly. I haven't got another memoir in me, obviously. A few people have noticed that the more recent creative work, Map of the Floating City, the game, the Invisible Lighthouse film, and so on, are not very well documented in the book. And I think actually that's partly because I wanted to get it finished and handed in and so on. And so I sort of skimmed that. And I think in the back of my mind, I was thinking, well, the editor's going to come back with some comments and then I'll fix this. But I want to see what he has to say. In fact, the editor just sort of said, this is great, let's publish it, more or less. So that was a surprise and actually a bit annoying. I actually wanted a bit more of a pushback. It was partly that, and it was partly also, I thought, well, if there is something to go deeper into, it's the more recent stuff that I've done. Because making the game, making a new album after all that time, had quite a lot of aspects to it that were interesting in themselves. I don't know if it would be a book or a piece online or whatever. I really enjoyed the process. Especially the early process, getting it down, locking myself away for a few hours every day, don't come out till you've done 1,500 words kind of thing, and the stream of consciousness. I loved all of that. The harder bit actually was the editing process,
Were there writers you emulated at all? Or at least were there memoirs that you dug that you thought, if I could write in the mode of this guy or that guy? Or were you really just trying to get it out the sort of plain...
For some reason, when I started it, the book that was in my head was Go Ask Alice. Because that was the only thing I could think of that was sort of in a journaled format, that it was hard to imagine. Then, I loved it when I was a kid. Somebody pointed out to me it was probably written by the FBI, It was so it was a bit of a fraud. But I remembered the effect that it had on me when I was 14 or whatever it was. But actually, the publisher talked me out of the journaled format, said it was not in vogue these days, and I was quite upset, and I was worried that I would lose the immediacy if I did that. And he said, well, just, stay in the moment, and see how it goes. And to my surprise, I was able to sort of stay in the moment more or less. And the few comments I got back were actually, every now and then he'd say, look, maybe a paragraph of context here for those that, weren't around then, and that I was able to do without spoiling the immediacy of the rest. But I mean, what I always liked about it, about reading the journal entries, was that I didn't see the big picture. Really, was that I was just in these meetings, I was doing these gigs, and I didn't see the significance, and so I sort of blundered my way through it. And I thought, well, what makes it interesting reading is that you probably want to wring this guy's neck and sort of say, come on, surely you can see what's going on here,
But now you've got the big picture. And your wife just came home, so I think we're going to have to call the episode here.
Okay.
Thomas Dolby, thanks so much for coming on the Virtual Memories Show.
Thank you very much.
And that was Thomas Dolby. His new book is The Speed of Sound, Breaking the Barriers Between Music and Technology, from Flatiron Books, and it's fantastic. So do yourself a favor, buy that at your favorite bookstore. And go to thomasdolby.com to find out more about what he's up to. He's got a Facebook page that you can follow called Official Thomas Dolby, and he's also on Twitter at Thomas Dolby, all one word. And besides thanking him and his wife, Kathleen Beller, who was kind enough to record with me and also have a nice side conversation after we finished up, I really want to thank Flatiron Books publicity department for helping get this episode together. They also got me the Ed Ward episode from a few weeks ago that were, they did a really good job setting this up, and I appreciate their efforts. Now, once we wrapped the episode, after Kathleen came in, I did have time to ask Thomas, so, who are you reading? And if you want to hear his answer to that, it's a surprising one. You'll need to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories Show so you can get access to our monthly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. You can do that at patreon.com/VMSpod or at paypal.me/VMSpod. There are all sorts of goals and goodies in place for supporters of the show, including that podcast, a patron-only blog, the handwritten show notes for every episode, including this one, a series of ebooks I'm getting ready to launch, and more. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. Now, speaking of costs, this one was recorded at Thomas's home in Baltimore. I took a train down there and back. So between train fare, parking, Uber trips from Baltimore Penn Station out to his place and back, this episode cost around $350. Small price to pay for an experience like this, and I do this for love, not money. But if you want to help defray some of those costs, as well as the equipment, web hosting, etc., then please visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. You can make a recurring or one-time donation. A special thanks go out to Paul W. Jones, Kevin Katila, Michael Janizik, Fred Kish, Jonathan Kranz, Andrew Mason, Greg Tanner, Zach Martin, Craig P. Steffen, and Ron Slate for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories Show. We got the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Our music for this episode is Nothing's Gonna Bring Me Down by David Bayerwald, used with permission from the artist. David has a reunion project going with his great 80s band, David and David, and you can find out more and support that at facebook.com/DavidandDavidMusic. I know I should have used one of Thomas's songs for this episode, but I forgot to hit him up for permission, and I don't think it would be right to just steal anymore. And that is it for the 200th episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks for being here throughout, even if it hasn't been all 200 of them. We'll be back next week with return guest Brad Gooch, whose new book is Rumi's Secret, The Life of the Sufi Poet of Love. Until next time, you can subscribe to the show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store or at soundcloud.com/VMSpod. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. I've revamped the weekly email that I send out, so it's more of a fun, meditative, personal thing instead of a big info dump about the new show. So you should sign up for that if you have any interest in me. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter at VMSPod, on Facebook at facebook.com/virtualmemoriesshow, and at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com. And if you like this show, please go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and review for this podcast. That'll help us build a bigger audience. Until next time, you have been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. For 200 episodes now, I am your host, Gil Roth, and you are awesome. Keep it that way.